Hey, welcome to another episode of Cam. Welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to be talking about caffeine. So caffeine is something that I got interested in a few months back, just trying to think about my health, making some diet changes and all, and caffeine is a drug that does affect us. So I wanted to see just how it affects us, right? Specifically, how does it affect me? So today is February the 25th. I quit on January the 1st. I actually drank caffeine in coffee, and the reason I'm saying in coffee is because during this time period I did not know that chocolate actually contains caffeine. So I was drinking some homemade hot chocolate during these 55 days that I had quit caffeine. So I wasn't completely free of caffeine during this time, but mostly free of caffeine. Hot chocolate has far less caffeine than coffee. But I quit caffeinated coffee for 55 days, drank it for the first time yesterday because I want to see how it would affect me. And so during this time of abstinence of caffeine, I wanted to just research it to see what research is out there, what we know about caffeine, how does it affect us, right? Does it affect us in a positive way or a negative way? So I just want to talk about some of those things in this video. So caffeine is a drug, and the way it works, I'm not going to be able to go into too deep detail, but you have adenosine receptors in your brain. These adenosine receptors make you feel tired. They're what make you feel sleepy and tell you need to go to sleep. And what caffeine does is it comes into your brain and it blocks those adenosine receptors. So most people say, I need a pick-me-up, I need an energy boost, they're going to consume caffeine. Well, caffeine isn't giving you an energy boost, it's simply delaying your tiredness, if you will. So it's almost like borrowing energy from the future, kind of. And so it blocks those adenosine receptors, you no longer feel tired, you no longer feel sleepy, you feel energized. But what happens is those adenosine receptors are still building up throughout the day, and as the caffeine wears off, those adenosine receptors flood back in, and that's why you have the caffeine crash, right? Because now all those adenosine receptors have flooded back into your brain, the caffeine's no longer blocking them, and you get that crash and feel more tired maybe in the afternoon. And so you drink another cup of caffeine, and we're going to talk about why you don't want to do that here in a little bit. And so I quit caffeine, like I said, for the last 55 days, and I quit cold turkey, which is not something that I would recommend because it was not fun. I would recommend slowly weaning off. So if you're drinking 3 cups of coffee, go down to 2 for a little bit, then go down to 1, then go down to half a cup, and then maybe a quarter cup. You still might experience some side effects like a headache or something, but I don't think it'll be nowhere near as bad as some of the withdrawal symptoms that I had. So the first day didn't have any side effects, no symptoms. The second day I did have a slight headache, but it wasn't too bad, felt a little drowsy. Other than that, nothing too bad. Day 3, woke up in the morning and I had slight muscle aches in my legs. As the day went on, they got worse. They got so bad that night that laying in bed, it was just so much discomfort I couldn't go to sleep. So I had to take some ibuprofen in order to fall asleep that third night. The 4th day, no change. The aches were probably a little worse. Suffered through it through the day, complained about it a lot, and had to take ibuprofen again that night to sleep on the 4th night. Day 5, still some slight muscle aches, but much, much better. Didn't need to take any medication to fall asleep on the 5th night. Day 6 was feeling much, much better. Pretty much no side effects whatsoever. Day 7 felt great, felt completely normal. So that was kind of my withdrawals of the caffeine. The rest of the time with caffeine abstinence, never felt like I needed caffeine to make me feel awake or to make me feel more energized. One thing that I did notice was that my energy levels and my feeling tired throughout the day was directly tied to the amount and quality of sleep that I got the night before. So most nights I slept good. My energy levels were good the next day, but it was during the winter here, and we do heat our house with wood. And so when it gets very cold, which here where I live doesn't happen too often, but there are some periods of times where 4 or 5 days we got a cold spell, I'll heat the house with wood. And so that happened, and there was a couple of nights there where getting up a couple of times in the middle of the night, waking up to go put wood on the fire to keep it going. And so those days, I felt more tired the next day because of that lack of sleep and disruption of sleep the night before. It was interesting too, something that happened was I would wake up before my alarm, and when I woke up I was like awake. It was like I was not going back to sleep. So if my alarm was going to go off at 4 a.m. and I woke up at 3:40, I was not falling asleep for those 20 minutes. Like, I was awake. So that was kind of interesting, and I think the reason that is because caffeine does affect your sleep. So you may be able to sleep throughout the whole night, but it's going to affect your deeper sleep. I think they call it the phase 3 and 4 or something like that. But it affects that deep sleep, that restorative sleep, the sleep that's going to actually make you feel refreshed the next day. So again, you may sleep through the whole night, not wake up, feel like you slept great, but the caffeine is affecting that deep sleep that makes you feel refreshed. So what I think was happening, the reason for this kind of change of when I wake up I feel very refreshed, was because I was getting deep sleep again, right? Because I was drinking coffee every day, probably 24 ounces. Sometimes I drink it in the afternoon or even at night, and I was always one that was like, I go straight to sleep, don't wake up, coffee, caffeine doesn't affect me. But what I wasn't realizing is it was affecting my deep sleep. That's why I would wake up and I would feel drowsy or I'd feel tired, because I wasn't getting that deep restorative sleep that I would otherwise get. So that was kind of interesting with the whole quitting caffeine, something that I noticed in myself. Some other things that I learned, caffeine, other than its effects on sleep, some other downsides to caffeine is anxiety, which I can't say I've ever really suffered from anxiety, didn't really see any change there. But if you are someone who does suffer from anxiety, caffeine does affect some people in a way that gives them anxiety. Some people just can't take caffeine. If you're someone who, if you consume too much caffeine, you get very jittery, very shaky, you may be someone whose anxiety is affected by caffeine, and you may want to consider cutting it back or even quitting to see if it helps your anxiety. The other thing is caffeine in pregnant women. So I always have heard that, if you're pregnant, you shouldn't consume caffeine. But the reason that is because some studies show that caffeine during pregnancy could result in the development of the baby not being as good as otherwise if you were abstaining from caffeine. So there were some studies done where they compared the babies of women who did not consume caffeine to the women who did consume caffeine. And the women that were consuming caffeine, their babies were they weighed less, they were smaller. There were some studies that even said maybe their brain was a little bit smaller. So that was kind of interesting. And I think the reason is, I also read that caffeine constricts the blood vessels to the uterus and the placenta. So that might have something to do with the development of the baby. I'm not really sure. But nonetheless, there are some studies that show caffeine can have effects on the birth of a child. So again, that's something to consider. Maybe if you're pregnant, don't be consuming caffeine. There are studies out there that say as long as you're under 200 milligrams, it doesn't matter, it's not going to affect your baby. And then there are other studies that say any consumption of caffeine will affect the child. So again, there's kind of some debate there on whether or not it matters. But if you want to be safe, just don't drink it at all. The problem with telling people to limit their caffeine to 200 milligrams is that in coffee, if you're drinking your caffeine, consuming your caffeine through coffee, the caffeine amounts in coffee can vary greatly. They can be dependent on the brew strength, the amount of grounds that are put in the coffee, the growing conditions of the plant that the coffee bean came from, the roast type, right, mild, medium, dark. All these things can affect the amount of caffeine in coffee. There's actually some studies done where they would take a 16 ounce of Dunkin' Donuts coffee, and it might have 143 milligrams, and then they go and get a 16 ounce of Starbucks coffee, and it would have twice as much milligrams of caffeine in it. There was actually one person who took 7 16 ounce breakfast blend coffees at Starbucks, so exact same size, exact same blend. They did it 7 different days, so it wasn't all the same day, but 7 different days. They bought this 16 ounce breakfast blend coffee at Starbucks, and the ranges were from like 260 milligrams, I think it was, and the lowest was the lowest amount in a cup, and the highest was as high as 560 some milligrams. So again, that's a big variance. So if you tell someone, limited to 200 milligrams, and they'll say, well, that's about a cup of coffee. Well, that's not really true, because it very much depends on, like I said, all those other factors that can affect the amount of caffeine in a cup of coffee. So better safe than sorry, just don't consume caffeine at all if you're pregnant. So that's kind of the main downsides to caffeine, the sleep being probably the biggest one, and then anxiety, and of course if you're pregnant, just don't consume caffeine. There are some positives to caffeine, some positives being that it does give you that pick-me-up, right? It does block those adenosine receptors that are making you feel tired, so it gives you what feels like an energy boost. It can give you a better focus, right? If you're not tired, you're more awake, you feel more focused, right? It can help you to get projects done or to feel at your best when you're working on maybe a work project or a test or something. That caffeine can help you in that area. There are some studies that show caffeine helps with memory loss. I think it has something to do with the adenosine receptors, something to do with the brain going on there, but it can help with memory loss, maybe help with Alzheimer's, dementia, and preventing those. So that's some possible positive side effects to caffeine. The issue is that a lot of it seems uncertain. That's kind of what I found in my research. No one really, truly, I think, knows the effects of caffeine on us other than what we experience in and of ourselves. So yeah, it's kind of interesting. One interesting thing about caffeine is the question comes up, is caffeine addictive? I don't think I would call it addictive, but 100% it is reinforcing. So reinforcing is like a trigger that causes you to act in a behavior over and over. So you continue to come back to that behavior because of the caffeine. Here it's most people is drinking coffee or energy drink or tea, right? They do that every day because caffeine is reinforcing. And you may not even realize that it's reinforcing. So it's been shown that you can have the same food or the same drink, and if one has caffeine in it and the other does not, people will always choose the one with the caffeine. It's kind of interesting, right, how that happens. They've done tests with placebos, right, where people are given 2 drinks. One has a placebo, one has caffeine. They don't know which one, but they continually choose the ones with caffeine, right? And so caffeine is reinforcing in that way. There were some studies done with honeybees showing the same thing, where honeybees collecting the nectar from the Caffeine plant would continue to go back to that, and they would remember the reward they got from that Caffeine plant. It said even up to 72 hours more than the pollinators that weren't getting nectar from a plant with caffeine in it. So that memory of reward lasted longer for those pollinators getting the nectar from plants with caffeine in it. So that's kind of interesting and shows that even in the animal world, caffeine is reinforcing. In terms of downsides to caffeine, and I think this is in terms of like major downsides as far as death and all, caffeine can kill you if you take a dosage too high, like a single dose. That's way too high, but those are very, very rare. What's sad is that when looking at how many deaths happen annually, I think it was since like 1940s, maybe 1950s, there's only been 92 deaths attributed to caffeine overdose. most of those with suicide, which is sad. And what is troubling is you can go get caffeine pills without any regulations. You can just go buy it off the internet. So that's kind of troubling there that there's no regulations surrounding caffeine. But the problem is the FDA doesn't know what to do with it, because it's not like smoking, where if you smoke, your whole life, you're probably going to end up with lung cancer. There's no long-term side effects to caffeine that we know of. It's not like alcohol, where it impairs your ability to, drive or function. Caffeine, if anything, helps you function, right? Because it makes you more awake and more focused. So I think there's just some maybe research that needs to be done further, deeper, to actually know the side effects of caffeine. It's kind of what I learned from all this. Nobody really knows fully the effects of caffeine. So that's why I think it was cool to experiment for myself. Maybe encourage you to experiment for yourself. Maybe quit caffeine for a period of time, 30, 60, 90 days, just to see how it affects you. I'm now doing a new experiment. I drank coffee for the first time yesterday. I was interested to see how it affected me. It affected me, I can't say that I felt any major boost of energy from it. Maybe that morning a little bit. But something that is interesting, later that afternoon, so I drank my coffee probably around 7 that morning, and actually didn't finish it till probably 10:30. But that afternoon around 3:30, 4 o'clock, I was sitting on the couch working on a lesson for church, and was dozing off. And that had not happened the previous 55 days. So again, I think that was that crash of caffeine coming in, making me sleepy and falling asleep. So yeah, I can't say that caffeine, I see any benefit of caffeine for me after being off of it for 55 days. So yeah, I think where I'm at now with caffeine, I don't think it's necessarily harmful. And as far as the sleep goes, a lot of people tell you this. If you're going to drink caffeine, you need to stop 12 hours before you go to sleep, because caffeine has a caffeine's quarter life is 10 to 12 hours. So what that means is 12 hours after consuming caffeine, 25% of that caffeine is still going to be active 12 hours later, right? So again, if you drink a cup of coffee at 2 o'clock in the afternoon because you got a meeting or something you want to be awake for, well, at 2 a.m., 25% of that caffeine is still active in you. And most people are asleep at 2 a.m. So that's why it's affecting our sleep, even if we don't fully realize it. So if you go to bed at 10 o'clock, you want to drink your last cup of coffee or soda or however you get your caffeine. You want to stop consuming it by 10 a.m. So that's one tip, to kind of still consume caffeine but not have it affect your sleep as bad. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to be running a marathon later this year, and so I do my bigger runs on Saturdays, and so I kind of want to see how caffeine affects my performance, because again, researching this, they do say caffeine affects performance. People who drink caffeine every day, it's not going to affect you as much, but people who abstain from caffeine and then take it like day 7 on the day of their marathon or whatever, the caffeine had a greater performance impact than if you were taking the caffeine every day. Still had an impact if you're taking caffeine every day, but a greater impact if you abstain from it for 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 days and then take the caffeine. So I'm kind of going to play with that experiment to see if consuming caffeine on Saturdays only affects my longer runs training for this marathon. So I'll probably post another video on that to see how that goes. But that's all I got for this one. Again, part of what this channel is for is I have interest in nutrition, diet, experimenting with some of these things, with fitness, health. These are things that I'm interested in. So I want to make this video on caffeine. Hope you enjoyed it. If if you are going to try to give up caffeine to see how it affects you, I would recommend it. Let me know in the comments. Give this video a like. Click subscribe. Very much appreciate it. And we'll see you on the next video.